Welcome to Hatman Strikes Back Daily Boxing News. So you see the title of the stream. Derek Chisora, according to Frank Warren, has been made mandatory for Daniel Dubois. We'll get onto that, but we're first going to go through some other boxing news. So let's have a look here. What's on the agenda? Cuban heavyweight Lenia Perez has signed a co-promotional deal with Matchroom Boxing and BoxLab Promotions. I'll come on to who Lenia Perez is in a moment. Shout out to everybody in the live chat. If you can all stick a like on this video, on this live stream, it'll be really appreciated. I will come on to your questions and comments once we got through some of this boxing news, all right? So, Lenia Perez, a 2016 Cuban Olympian and undefeated pro heavyweight, has signed a co-promotional deal with Matchroom Boxing and BoxLab Promotions. Perez, 11-0, 8 KOs, will make his official Matchroom debut on the Matchroom roster on April 18 when he faces, how'd you pronounce that name? Detralius? Let's call him that. Detralius Webster, who is 9-4 with 5 KOs at the Caribe Royale in Orlando, Florida. The 32-year-old Perez is riding a 5-fight knockout streak, but has struggled to maintain momentum in his career since turning pro in 2019. Still, despite not fighting since last March, Perez has managed to attain a number 4 ranking with the WBA. He said, "I'm excited to take this next step in my career with Matchroom and BoxLab Promotions as my co-promoters. Together, we'll bring my journey to the world stage, and I'm ready to show everyone why I'm an undefeated force in the heavyweight division. The time is now to take my career to the next level. We're delighted to welcome," and now Eddie Hearn is talking obviously. Eddie Hearn said, "We're delighted to welcome Lenia to the Matchroom team. The heavyweight division is always evolving, and Lenia has the tools to become a real contender. We're excited to be working with Amaury and the BoxLab team on Lenia's progression, and we'll be looking for him to make a big impression on the division this year." And Perez went on to say, "I'm thrilled to be working with Eddie Hearn and the Eddie Hearn and the team at Matchroom on advancing Lenia Perez's career." No, this is BoxLab Promotions talking now. I'm getting it all mixed up already. So Amaury Piedra of BoxLab Promotions said, "I'm thrilled to be working with Eddie Hearn and the team at Matchroom on advancing Lenia Perez's career. This former Cuban Olympian has passed all the tests in the pro ranks, earning a top ranking with the WBA. Now is the time to join forces with Matchroom so we can together take him to new heights and show the world this future heavyweight champion." So here he is, Lenia Perez, 11-0, 8 KOs, 6'4.5", 79-inch reach, 32 years of age, from Cuba. He's based in Miami, Florida, as so many Cuban fighters are. This is from his Wikipedia page. You can see he had a decent amount of success. He's a southpaw, if I hadn't mentioned already. Decent amount of success in the amateurs. Pan American Games gold medalist in 2011 and also 2015 at 2 different weights. Heavyweight in 2011 and super heavyweight in 2015. He won the Youth Olympics in 2010 in Singapore and the World Championships at heavyweight in 2010. Now, he was in the 2016 Rio Olympics. There's the other tournaments that I just alluded to a moment ago. But he was also in the 2016 Olympics. He won his first round bout. He beat Guido Vianello. But then in the quarterfinals, he was defeated and actually stopped by Filip Hrgović. So that's something to note, because obviously amateur boxing is different than pro boxing, but if you're getting stopped in the amateurs, does that mean something? You guys let me know what you think. This is his professional record so far. He's literally fought nobody. His best win was over this guy, Victor Vikrist, who is not a very good fighter. So, let me know what you guys think about this signing for Matchroom Boxing of Lanier Perro. I think some of their heavyweight signings have been kind of curious because they're not going after the real top talent, the guys who you think or who would seem are going to go on to be surefire world champions and what have you. They're going after guys who are kind of, to put it politely, flying under the radar. So, yeah, let me know what you think about it. Now, moving from one heavyweight, and by the way, we'll get on to Teremoana in just a moment because he's another one of the Matchroom heavyweight signings. But moving from one Cuban heavyweight in Lanier Perro, and by the way, Lanier Perro's got a brother called Danny Perro, who's younger than him, also a southpaw. I'm not sure who he's signed to right now. Will he sign to Matchroom? Is he signed to somebody else? Maybe we'll talk about him in a separate stream, or I'll do a video about him. But yeah, he does have a younger brother who's also ranked in the top 10 in the heavyweight division right now. We'll come on to the heavyweight rankings as well. So from one Cuban heavyweight to another, Dillian Whyte has signed Mike Perez, of all people, to a management contract, as I understand it. It says here, Whyte, 36, is expecting his leading heavyweight Fabio Wardley to next fight Kubrat Pulev. Whyte also works in a management capacity, and he has also signed Cuba's Mike Perez. Now, some of you may remember that Mike Perez's last fight, this is Perez's box rec here. I'm sure most of you are familiar with him. 39 years of age now. Okay, so right on the doorstep of 40, 6'1" in height, based in Cork Island, obviously, from Cuba originally. 30-3 with one draw, 21 wins by knockout. One of his losses was by knockout as well. That was to Alexander Povetkin. He got stopped by him in the first round and later claimed that he drank a whole bottle of rum before he went out to fight. How many of you guys believe that story? I mean, I don't know. He said he had an issue with drinking. He was overweight for all of his previous heavyweight career, before he moved down to cruiserweight. He was always overweight. At least when he was in Prize Fighter, maybe he wasn't. But after he won Prize Fighter, whatever it was, 30 grand or something, he just seemed to spend all that money on pigging out. And he ballooned up. So, that's Mike Perez. I'm sure you guys are familiar. This was his last fight against Israel Duffus. And you can see the guy's a habitual loser. Look at the right side. Yeah, under Duffus's picture. That was his record going into the Perez fight. So, an absolute pie. And this was on the Dillian Whyte, Ebenezer Tete undercard. So, perhaps that's where they formed this, business relationship. Mike Perez and Dillian Whyte was when he got Mike Perez to fight on the undercard. And bear in mind, Dillian Whyte's previous fight against Christian Hammer was in Ireland. Dillian Whyte claimed some type of ancestry back to Ireland. And, like I say, he fought Christian Hammer in Ireland under an Irish license. And Mike Perez has been based in Ireland for most of his pro career, if not all of his pro career. So, maybe that's where the link-up came, was Dillian Whyte training over there and, got to know the guy and decided to sign him to a management contract. Who knows? But let me know what you guys think about that link-up. Okay, so another Eddie Hearn heavyweight. I say another. He doesn't have that many. Teremoana, otherwise known as Teremoana Jr., signed to Eddie Hearn recently. He's had a couple of fights under him now. 6'6", former Olympian. He lost to Bakadir Jalalov in the most recent Olympics on points. I didn't realize the year before he'd actually lost to Jalalov as well, but got stopped because I was impressed by Teremoana's ability to take Jalalov's power when they fought last time. But apparently the time before, he wasn't able to take Jalalov's power so well, unless he got stopped on cuts or stopped in his feet. I haven't seen their first fight. I only saw their more recent fight. But yeah, he was stopped by Jalalov in 2023. So you have to bear that in mind. Now, Teremoana is 27 years of age. This was his last opponent, James Singh, okay? Now, obviously, this is very early on in Teremoana Jr.'s career, embryonic stages, but the guy is 27 years old. So if he was 22, then you'd say, okay, whatever, he's fighting pies. This is the normal procedure that you take a young fighter through, where you're building his confidence, you're getting him used to fighting in front of big crowds, you're getting him used to fighting on maybe big shows, way down on the undercard, etc., etc. He needs to be comfortable in that type of environment before you step him up. That's the idea. But being 27 years of age, 7 fights in, they don't have the time on their side that they would have with a 22-year-old. And Teremoana is not somebody that is inexperienced. He's not a Fabio Wardley coming from basically a non-existent amateur background. Fabio Wardley had a few white collar bouts. That's it. No, Teremoana had an extensive amateur background. And as I say, fought in the Olympics, fought Bakadir Jalalov at least twice. So when you combine that with his age, this is a guy that you're going to have to start moving quite quickly. You don't want to end up with another Joe Joyce, because Joyce probably spent his best years in the amateurs and maybe the tail end of his best years when he just turned pro. The guy's never fought for a world title, Joe Joyce. Okay, so you don't want a repeat of that with Teremoana. So you're going to have to get a move on, particularly with the way he fights. He's very aggressive. He's high energy. That's a young man's style. If he was a more technical boxer, maybe you'd take your time with him a bit more, right? But a guy who's this aggressive, who fights high energy, especially for a big man, 6'6", you're going to need to capitalize on the energy levels he has right now at the age of 27 by getting him in there and fighting for a world title by the time he's 30 at the latest. Do you know what I mean? Probably by the time he's 29 would be a better idea if you can maneuver him into that position. So I say that to say that opponents like James Singh are really not helping his cause. Again, I understand it's very early on in his career, and you would normally give a fighter who's 6-0, 7-0 these type of opponents. But in this instance, Teremoana has the experience to be moved faster, and he's too old not to be moved faster, in my opinion. So I saw Eddie Hearn talk after the fight about how they're going to need to step him up. Well, yeah, they're seriously going to need to step him up beyond the level of a James Singh. I mean, the fight was an absolute farce. Not sure how many of you guys saw it, but yeah, it wasn't the least bit competitive. I mean, James Singh did land a couple right hands, but there was nothing on them. Teremoana is very keen to go looking for the knockout, and he did walk onto a couple, but yeah, nothing bothered him. There didn't appear to be an enormous amount of power behind those shots. So let me know what you guys think about Teremoana and how you think his career is being moved so far. Maybe give some suggestions for opponents. I'm not saying they need to step him up for world titles next, obviously. What I'm saying is they're going to need to give him some more durable opponents than this. And there are plenty of durable guys out there, okay? It shouldn't be that difficult to get hold of somebody durable. James Singh obviously was not. So Eddie Hearn needs to do better in the coming fights with Teremoana in terms of matchmaking. So let's move on then to the main subject of today's stream. According to Frank Warren, Derek Chisora has been made mandatory challenger for IBF heavyweight champion Daniel Dubois. Now, if we have a look at the old IBF heavyweight rankings before they were updated, you'll see on the far left here, Daniel Dubois champion at the top. Derek Chisora was ranked number 9. Now, in the new rankings, Derek Chisora has catapulted up to number 2. Inexplicably. Here's me saying that the IBF are better than the other sanctioning bodies for the most part. And I would stand by that, by the way. But they're not perfect. And this is an example of how they're not perfect. How on earth does a guy go from being ranked number 9 and then all he's done in the meantime is beat Otto Wallin, right? In fact, I think this number 9 position might have been given to him after he beat Otto Wallin. Because you notice Otto Wallin is down at number 12 now. So I think this was actually given to Chisora after he beat Wallin. Because the Wallin fight was an eliminator. It was not a final eliminator. There's a difference. A standard eliminator is just a ranking match. It gets you a ranking in the top 10, top 15. A final eliminator guarantees you a title shot within a certain time period. Okay? So, Derek Chisora, after winning the eliminator against Otto Wallin, was apparently ranked number 9. He might have been slightly higher and then he's been moved down since because people above him have perhaps been active. But either way, he was nowhere near the top. But somehow, the IBF have endeavored to put him in at number 2, above a Jagba, Frank Sanchez, Anthony Joshua, Filip Hrgović. To be fair, these are all guys, apart from a Jagba, coming off losses. Sanchez hasn't won since his loss to Ajit Caballel. AJ is coming off the loss to Dubois. Hrgović is coming off a loss to Dubois. Only Justice Huni, Wardley, Italma, Hunter, and Anderson. Okay, these guys, but then again, I've missed out. Where's Derek Chisora gone there in the IBF? Oh yeah, sorry, he's at the top. So yeah, he's leapfrogged all these guys. Chisora was number 9 before, so he's basically leapfrogged Moses Italma, Fabio Wardley, Justice Huni, who are coming off wins. Yeah? And of course, Martin Bakole was at the top before. Now he's dropped all the way down to number 10 following his loss to Joseph Parker. Now, there may be something in the IBF rules whereby if you get a situation where somebody pulls out of a final eliminator, which is what F.A. Jagba has essentially done. His scheduled bout with Bakole was supposed to be the IBF final eliminator. But inexplicably, after Bakole got stopped in 2 rounds by Joseph Parker, Jagba decided to go ahead with the Bakole fight anyway, with it not being an IBF final eliminator anymore. Very, very strange decision. I've addressed this before. And he must be kicking himself now that he's decided to go ahead and fight Martin Bakole outside of, an IBF final eliminator, because surely he would have seen the Derek Chisora fight as a more winnable one than Martin Bakole. Maybe the Saudis offered him a bag. I'm sure they did. But sometimes the short-term gain is at the expense of long-term gain. Martin Bakole perhaps has found that out himself, or will find that out himself, because he took a bag for short-term gain against Parker. It backfired. And that affects his brand. There won't be so many members of the public, even if he beats a Jagba, pressuring the big names to fight him. In my opinion, it was a very foolish decision of Martin Bakole to fight Joseph Parker on such short notice when he wasn't in shape, hadn't even slept, etc., etc. But equally foolish, in my view, for F.A. Jagba to still go ahead and fight Bakole when it's no longer an eliminator. He could be fighting Derek Chisora in an eliminator. Surely his people could pressure the IBF and say, hey, look, I know Chisora won a ranking match, a normal eliminator, a standard eliminator against Otto Wallin, but we were poised and we were ready to go in there in a final eliminator against Martin Bakole. Jagba was ranked highly and so on, much higher than Chisora. So, yeah, it's a head scratcher why Jagba's chosen to do what he's done. But according to Frank Warren, Derek Chisora has now leapfrogged him. And this is just according to Warren, because I have checked on the IBF website and there is nothing yet about Derek Chisora. I've checked in their news section and everything. There's nothing yet about him being made mandatory. He's currently ranked number 2. There's nobody rated at number 1. It doesn't mean it's not true. He might actually be the mandatory, but I haven't yet heard it from the IBF. And the reason I want to emphasize this point is because Frank Warren once claimed that the Daniel Dubois-Anthony Joshua fight was a mandatory defense for Dubois, when it definitely wasn't. Again, Anthony Joshua had fought in a regular eliminator against, I think it was actually Otto Wallin as well, right? Otto Wallin getting these standard eliminators is kind of strange. Well, at least in the case of the Chisora fight, not in the AJ fight, because he was coming off a win over Murat Gassiev. In fact, maybe I've got it. Yeah, Gassiev, I think, was an eliminator with Otto Wallin. I'm not sure if the AJ fight actually was, but if it was, it would have been a standard eliminator, not a final eliminator. And the reason I bring that up is because Frank Warren really didn't want Daniel Dubois to fight Martin Bakole. So he was trying to make out as though the AJ fight was Dubois' mandatory, like retrospectively, because there was no talk of it being mandatory beforehand. But after the fact, he was like, oh yeah, that was a mandatory for Dubois. So if you've just had a mandatory, that means with the IBF, you don't have another mandatory for another 9 months. Yeah, you see how that works? Whereas if AJ weren't a mandatory, then he would have had a mandatory much sooner. And it turned out, of course, that the mandatory would have been much sooner. And that AJ wasn't Dubois' mandatory at all. So bear that in mind when Frank Warren's coming out now saying that Derek Chisora is mandatory for Dubois. Obviously, these are both Frank Warren fighters. So it's very possible that Warren's managed to work his way with the boxing politics and whatnot and persuade the IBF that this is the right decision. We shall see. But on a purely boxing basis, well, a health basis, really, how many of you guys want to see Derek Chisora fight Daniel Dubois? Or even Derek Chisora fight Alexander Usyk in a rematch? I don't think that will ever happen, because Usyk is basically saying he's got 1 fight left. 2 fights, but the second fight he says he's going to be a show fight, an exhibition basically. So he's got 1 real fight left. And surely that's going to be the Dubois fight. Win or lose, he's not going to have, according to what he said recently, he's not going to have any more serious boxing matches after this Dubois rematch. So I don't see him fighting Derek Chisora again. And I wouldn't want to see it, to be honest. Nor would I want to see Derek Chisora fight Daniel Dubois. Derek Chisora is one of these guys who is literally addicted to the sport of boxing. He's addicted to it. Now, there's been many people in the live chat over the past couple of months who've been adamant that Joe Joyce's speech has been seriously deteriorating and that he's now punch drunk and he's suffering the early stages or maybe advanced stages of pugilistic dementia. Personally, I don't see it. In fact, I don't have the screenshot to hand here, unfortunately. In fact, let me get this screenshot up here. All right, I'll get the screenshot up of the interview I'm talking about, because Joe Joyce did an interview the other day, or maybe last week, whenever it was. And he was speaking perfectly fine in the interview. And this is what I'm saying. I don't see this whole Joe Joyce terribly deteriorated speech thing that other people see. Or I don't hear it, you know? I do not hear it in Joe Joyce's speech at all. So I'm just taking a screenshot here. I'm going to put it up on screen so you guys know which interview to go watch. And then you can go and watch some of his older interviews pre-Zhang. Yeah, just look at the interviews he did before the first Jelly Zhang fight, or even even the Daniel Dubois fight. His speech was the same as it is now, at least to my ear. I really don't hear any difference. Joe Joyce has always been a slow talker. And yeah, that's just the way it's always been. Hang on. I'm just typing this in here to OBS. 1 second. I'm going to put a screenshot up so you guys can see it. Let's delete this. Okay. So there we got Joe Joyce. Let's get that centered. Yeah, if you go watch that interview from 9 days ago, Joe Joyce breaks silence on Dillian Whyte injury and warns Filip Hrgović. He's talking fine in the interview. I mean, fine by his standards, right? He's not like taking forever to answer questions. He's not struggling to put his words together, so on and so forth. He's relatively fluid in his speech by his standards in this interview. So, yeah, I don't really see the deterioration with Joe Joyce. I do, however, definitely see and hear the deterioration with Derek Chisora. Derek Chisora's speech is noticeably slurred now. There's absolutely no question about it whatsoever. So with Chisora, I'm 100% in agreement with you guys. Yeah, he, to me, has the early stages of pugilistic dementia. And if he's talking this badly at the age he is now, whatever he is, 40, imagine what he's going to be like at 50, 60, 70. You know, there are many older fighters from previous generations who no longer appear on camera, who don't do interviews because they are so diminished neurologically. Right? Their brain is literally mush because of all the blows they've taken to the head. I mean, some of them do actually appear on camera. The likes of James Toney, you can barely understand what he's saying. Riddick Bowe, he's another one. You could barely understand what that guy's saying. And bear in mind, Riddick Bowe retired the first time in his real career in his late 20s. He was about 27, 28 after the Andrew Golota rematch. And he did come back after that sporadically here and there. But they were just for low-level fights against journeymen. And he never really took any serious punishment, apart from when he partook in a kickboxing match, which I think he lost at some stage. That was way, way, way after his boxing career was over. But yeah, the bulk of the damage that he took, Riddick Bowe, was back in the 1990s. And he retired at, as I say, about 27, 28. And the damage he took up until that age is why the guy is punch drunk today. Terribly punch drunk. So, you know, Derek Chisora, in my view, as much as he keeps coming back and winning fights that we don't expect him to win, he needs to be saved from himself. When fighters start noticeably slurring their words and getting punch drunk, if the British board had any consistency about them, they would prevent Derek Chisora from fighting. They'd take his license off him like they took Danny Williams' license off him. And funny enough, Derek Chisora, of course, stopped Danny Williams back in the days in 2 rounds. Was that Williams' last ever fight in the UK? I can't remember now, but it wasn't too long after that the British Boxing Board of Control revoked his license on health grounds. Now, some people say, well, if, using Danny Williams as an example, if the British board were to do that, Derek Chisora would just do what Danny Williams did and fight overseas. You can't stop him. There's always going to be some country somewhere that's going to give you a license, and that's true. However, Derek Chisora is a prize fighter. If he can't get paid the way he does in the UK overseas, then that might discourage him. Now, he says he's going to retire after 2 more fights anyway, but that might be 2 fights too many. In fact, he's already had too many fights, just judging by his speech. So, what say you? Derek Chisora mandatory for Daniel Dubois. I would certainly be concerned for his health. Yes, Derek Chisora's proved me wrong many times in the past. But win or lose against Daniel Dubois, and I'd be 95% sure he'd lose. Win or lose, he's going to take damage, surely, against the young, energetic, powerful, in-form heavyweight. It's going to be an ordeal for Derek Chisora. Most of Derek Chisora's fights are an ordeal. Even the Wallin fight, although he won it in my mind and on my card comfortably, he still had to take punishment in there. He was still bashed up by the end of the fight. That's how it is for Derek Chisora. When he fought Joe Joyce, same thing. He was bashed up by the end of the fight. So, yeah, for me, he needs to call it quits now. Going in there against Daniel Dubois, Would I watch? I'd watch for the sake of my channel. I'd be watching through my hands though. Hands covering my face. Wincing as Derek Chisora gets hit. Hoping that he actually sees out the night and is able to go home to his family. Obviously, he'll be damaged more than he was before, but hopefully not critically damaged. So anyway, I'm going to throw this over to the live chat. I'll get to your super chats first, if there are any. Let's get some different visuals on screen here. What are we going to choose? All right, we'll go with the boxing venues. London boxing venues. Shout out to Lawrence King for his super chat. He says, bro, Chisora being mandatory is nuts. It is too. Again, he did win an eliminator. And it's like, because the final eliminator between Ajagba and Bakoli fell through, because Bakoli lost, they've retroactively changed, if what Frank Warren's saying is correct, they've retroactively changed the Chisora-Wallin normal eliminator, standard eliminator, into a final eliminator. I don't understand why they wouldn't just match Derek Chisora against somebody else in the final eliminator. I don't get it. Was nobody available? Was Justice Hooney not available? Or somebody, the highest ranked available contender? I find it odd, but there you go. Kayvon Green, also with a super chat, he says, crazy take, I got Chisora winning. You got Chisora beating Dubois? I mean, it's heavyweight boxing. Anything is possible theoretically, but I would find that extremely unlikely. Personally, I can't see Derek Chisora beating Daniel Dubois at all. But shout out to Kayvon Green. Lawrence King with a super chat says, do I think Chisora should be mandatory? Hell no. However, 4 wins in his last 5, Wallin, Joyce, Washington, and Pulev, and only lost to Fury, so it's not bad, but yeah, still don't think mandatory. And you make a good point. Derek Chisora has strung together some wins, and so this would not be the most scandalous mandatory we've ever seen, but it's a bit of a stretch, isn't it? And as I say, it's kind of curious that the IBF didn't put Chisora in a final eliminator against somebody. Why did they just retroactively, if what Frank Warren is saying is true, why did they just retroactively change his standard eliminator against Wallin to a final eliminator? Why do that? Shout out to Lawrence King for the super chat. Shout out to KO for the super chat. He says, how does Usyk versus Lennox go in your mind? You know, it's really difficult to say because Lennox Lewis never fought a southpaw as a professional. And I've never seen footage of him fighting a southpaw in the amateurs. Let me just take a sip of my water here. Talking this much, I get a dry mouth. Hang on. Yeah, never seen Lennox Lewis fight a southpaw, amateur or pro. He may have faced southpaws in the amateurs, but as I say, I've never seen footage of it. So it's really hard to say. I might edge towards Lennox Lewis, but on a different day, I might give you a different answer. Because, as I say, we've never seen Lewis fight a southpaw. There was a time when he could have fought Chris Bird, but he decided not to go in that direction and pursue bigger names and more lucrative fights instead. But shout out to KO for the super chat. Shout out to Cash for the super chat. He says, off topic, but I think there's another reason Moses hasn't been able to get a title shot is that he turned pro in a stacked division filled with names, whereas Tyson turned pro in a weaker division. And that's a very good point, yes. Mike Tyson did turn pro in a weaker division. Obviously, Larry Holmes had lost to Michael Spinks a couple times and then retired, partly out of disgust because he felt like he got jobbed. And the belts were then held by Larry Holmes' leftovers, basically. Bone Crusher Smith, Pinkland Thomas, although he wasn't champion when Mike Tyson fought him, but he was somebody, again, that Tyson fought in a title defense. Trevor Berbick, of course, Larry Holmes' leftover. The only one who wasn't was Tony Tucker. But many of the people, most even, that Mike Tyson fought during his first reign as champion, not just when he became champion, but in his first reign, were all people that Larry Holmes had previously beaten. And by that stage of their career, they were old. Many of them, most of them. Several of them had serious substance abuse problems. Right? Pinklon Thomas was on Skag. Even Tyrell Biggs, who wasn't a Larry Holmes victim and was relatively young when he fought Mike Tyson, he had an issue with freebasing. From when he won the Olympics, he was smoking crack. It's crazy, right? This is the 1980s. It was a very, very rough time. And so, yeah, Mike Tyson came up during a weak division, and that certainly helped him. The belts were all fragmented. There were 3 belts at the time. If there's 3 belts, then there's more opportunity to get a title shot than if there's just 2 champions, right? Because then there was 3. So, yeah, you make a very good point, Cash. Big up, Cash, for the super chat. Brad with a super chat says, you said before Fury is more egotistical than AJ. Then do you think Usyk has a bigger ego than Fury and simply expresses it in a more healthy way, or is there something else at play? I don't know whether he's necessarily got a bigger ego than Fury. It isn't a case of the bigger your ego is, the better you're going to be as a fighter. It's not that simple. It's just that having a big ego is a component of being able to be successful in a gladiatorial sport like boxing. If you're somebody that has no ego, you've killed your ego, it's going to be very difficult for you at the higher levels. You need your ego. That's what gives you the will to win. That's what gives you the competitive spirit. That's what makes you feel like you're better than everybody. In tough times during a fight, when your opponent's putting it on you, your ego is what stops you from wilting. You see? So it's not that Usyk needs a bigger ego than Tyson Fury, or he has a bigger ego than Tyson Fury because he beat him. Doesn't quite work like that, in my mind at least. But he certainly has a big ego, yes. And as with a lot of these Eastern European fighters, because of their culture, they have this whole stoicism thing going on. Now, Usyk isn't the most stoic guy you've ever seen. He's quite a playful character, right? But as far as being braggadocious and openly arrogant and trash talking and all that kind of thing, that's not really part of the Eastern European or old Eastern Bloc, previous Soviet country, amateur boxing culture. Because that's kind of the code that these guys stick to, even in the pros, as far as the way they conduct themselves and behave. Obviously, there's been some exceptions, one of them being Sergey Kovalev, right? He is not typical of an Eastern European fighter in the sense that he's not as disciplined as many of the top Eastern Europeans typically are. And, Kovalev was more of a trash talker and more overtly egotistical. The majority of Eastern European fighters are not like that. But to be competing and succeeding at this level, yeah, you're going to have a hell of an ego, but you may think that it's bad PR to express that ego outwardly. So they conceal it. And as I say, it's also, I think, a cultural thing where they don't have the same culture of trash talk as Western fighters have, you know? So shout out to Brad for the super chat. Super chat here from Suited and Booted. He says, a fight we almost got, 90s Tyson versus 90s Foreman. Who wins? A declining Tyson versus an old Foreman. Then for fun, 80s Tyson versus 70s Foreman. In my opinion, Mike Tyson wins all those fights. All of them. That's probably not a very popular opinion, especially in the wake of Chisora. Especially in the wake of Foreman just passing away. It's not going to be a very popular opinion, but it's mine. Mike Tyson beats any version of George Foreman, in my view. I think that Foreman was too open. I mean, go and have a look at, if we're looking at the 70s version of Foreman, go and have a look at George Foreman against Ron Lyle. Look how easy it was for Ron Lyle to land shots on him. Ron Lyle dropped him twice in that fight, rocked him on numerous occasions. Obviously, Foreman came back. He dropped Lyle a bunch of times and stopped him. But Ron Lyle, I'm telling you folks, is no Mike Tyson. Taller than Tyson. Ron Lyle might have been about 6'2", You know, he might have been listed at 6'3" like Foreman, but he looked noticeably shorter in the fight. And yeah, if Lyle is doing that to you, if Lyle can land that easily on you, trust and believe Mike Tyson will be able to in his prime, without a shadow of a doubt. And if Lyle's hurting you like that, in my view, Mike Tyson will. Bear in mind, Ron Lyle, in terms of weight, was no bigger than Mike Tyson. Yes, he was a lot taller, but in terms of body mass, no. So I think Mike Tyson beats George Foreman in the 70s. I think he beats him in the 80s. Go and watch George Foreman when he fought Dwight Muhammad Qawi. That was George Foreman when he came back in the 1980s, and he was getting lit up like a Christmas tree by Dwight Qawi. It's only owing to the fact that Qawi didn't have the power to put a dent in Foreman that Foreman didn't find himself in serious trouble. All right, and Qawi, for those of you who don't know, was only about 5'7". A 5'7" guy had absolutely no problem whatsoever landing on George Foreman in the 1980s when he came back. And he was in good shape for that fight as well, George Foreman. I think he was about 235 pounds, which for the 80s Foreman, that's very good shape. That was the best shape he was ever in. So yeah, for me, Mike Tyson beats any version of George Foreman. As far as the declining Tyson, let's say the Tyson who fought Lennox Lewis versus Foreman, that's the one there that I might actually give George Foreman the edge. But the other two, Mike Tyson all day. If we're talking about Prime Tyson. Prime Tyson, in my view, beats any version of Foreman. But if we're talking about the Tyson who fought Lennox Lewis versus the George Foreman who fought maybe Holyfield, maybe I'll give Foreman the edge there. As I say, I'm expecting that to be an unpopular viewpoint. Shout out to Mr. Luca for the super chat. He says, Dubois really hurt Chisora, or I guess you meant to say will really hurt Chisora. Let's be real. I completely agree with you, Mr. Luca. Shout out to Harry for the super chat. He says, why do you reckon AJ made such simple novice mistakes against Dubois? I think because Dubois, with his jab and his foot speed and his aggression, was forcing AJ to work at a pace that he wasn't comfortable with, especially at his age. Not that AJ is totally ancient, but he's not quite as sprightly as he used to be, right? He's not quite as sprightly as he used to be. And that was the first young fighter, at least young fighter who was of any level, because Jermaine Franklin was relatively young. That was the first young fighter of any level that Anthony Joshua had fought in quite a while. And it really showed in there because he wasn't able to keep pace with Daniel Dubois. Dubois was fighting far too quickly for him. Far too many shots, far too much pressure. And the key in the fight was that jab. He was sticking that jab in AJ's face. Dubois bounces into his jab. He's got much quicker feet, Dubois, than people give him credit for. He bounces into that jab and he was knocking AJ's head back. And then right off that jab, he's unleashing these shots. So AJ was uncomfortable. He was made uncomfortable by Daniel Dubois' approach and by the speed of his attacks. Not that Daniel Dubois has the quickest hands in the world, he doesn't. But because his feet are quick and he moves in while he's throwing the shots, it accelerates the punches, if that makes sense. It's like a force multiplier, right? If he's standing still and throwing punches, Dubois, the shots are not that fast. But when he's moving in with those fast feet at the same time as punching, as I say, it makes everything faster. So, yeah, that's why I think AJ was making the novice mistakes, because he was uncomfortable. Dubois was forcing him into making novice mistakes. If AJ had been given time and space to relax his way into the fight, then I don't think he would have made as many errors as he did. So, Dubois did the right thing. And I did say that, even though I picked AJ to win, I did say that an AJ victory was contingent. I said this in all my pre-fight videos. An AJ victory over Dubois was contingent on him hitting Dubois with something big early in order to gain Dubois' respect. I said in all those videos, if he can't gain Dubois' respect and he can't get him to stand off and not rush him, then Anthony Joshua is in very serious trouble. Okay, because he cannot fight at the pace that Daniel Dubois fights at. He doesn't have that kind of stamina. He doesn't have that kind of energy and youth. I said that all along. But of course, I was sold on the idea that AJ would be able to land something big in the early rounds to keep Dubois off of him. Obviously, that didn't happen. And as I say, I always said that if AJ can't get this guy's respect, yeah, he's in a world of hurt. And that's what we saw. So, yeah, thank you to Harry for the super chat. All right, let me just pop out the chat box here. So you can have a swig of my water. Get dehydrated. Rusby says 90s Foreman did a lot better against Holyfield than Tyson did. Prime for prime, Foreman would have done Tyson what he did to Fraser. He was a lot tougher. Lyle hit harder than Tyson. Okay, I totally disagree that Lyle hit harder than Tyson, and he certainly didn't have Mike Tyson's speed. He didn't have Mike Tyson's, combination punching ability, his dynamic attacks or anything like that, Ron Lyle. Lyle was a good fighter, but he was no Mike Tyson. Now, yes, 90s Foreman did better against Holyfield than the post-prison Tyson did against Holyfield, for sure. But styles make fights. Styles make fights. Against big, strong, slow fighters, Mike Tyson generally had an absolute field day. Example or exhibit A would be Frank Bruno. Frank Bruno did well against certain people, but against Mike Tyson, he just got chewed up. He was too slow. If you're going to beat Mike Tyson, and all the guys who did beat Mike Tyson, by the way, apart from Kevin McBride, and that was right at the end of Tyson's career, all the guys who beat Mike Tyson had some speed about them. Even Danny Williams had pretty good hand speed, and that was a washed-up version of Tyson. When Tyson came up against slow guys, even if they hit hard, he's going to make mincemeat out of them, like he did with Frank Bruno. Not that Frank Bruno was better than George Foreman necessarily, but again, you're dealing with an old George Foreman, a sitting duck. Look at the Holyfield fight. Look at the shots he took in the Holyfield fight. He got absolutely battered in there. There were moments where Holyfield was able to get off, 15, 16 punch combinations. If Holyfield is getting off those type of combinations against you, trust me, Mike Tyson's going to be able to do the same. And Mike Tyson hits a hell of a lot harder than Holyfield. So, yeah, me personally, I see Mike Tyson making absolute mincemeat of certainly the old Foreman, but even Foreman in the 70s. Mike Tyson was a hell of a lot stronger than Joe Frazier. Bigger than Joe Frazier, too. I'm not talking about in terms of height. They were a similar height. But body mass. Mike Tyson was a solid 217 to 222. Rock solid. Joe Frazier in the Foreman rematch weighed about 220, and he looked like a tub of lard. Prime Joe Frazier, when he fought Muhammad Ali, was only about 206 or 207. He was very small. And even then, he didn't look ripped, right? So Joe Frazier today would be a pretty average-sized cruiserweight in his prime. He certainly wouldn't be a full-fledged heavyweight. It'd be a pretty average-sized cruiserweight. Mike Tyson would be more like a bridgerweight today. So, and Mike Tyson was just so much faster than Joe Frazier, hit harder, had a better chin. Mike Tyson had a very, very good chin. Joe Frazier was down multiple times in his career, obviously in the Foreman fights, but even against Oscar Bonavena. Muhammad Ali hurt Joe Frazier in their second fight. Mike Tyson was virtually iron-jawed. He had a very, very good chin. You look at the Frank Bruno fight. Bruno never had him on the deck. Yeah, he buzzed him once in the first fight. That's it. Bone Crusher Smith buzzed him. But again, Bone Crusher Smith is a guy who knocked Frank Bruno out. Bone Crusher Smith knocked out Tim Witherspoon in the first round. in their rematch. Mike Tyson never hit the deck until he fought Buster Douglas, and that was after 10 rounds of an absolute shellacking against Douglas. I mean, Douglas beat him from pillar to post before he eventually dropped him in the 10th. So Mike Tyson had a great chin. Look at the Razor Ruddock fights. Razor Ruddock was a fantastic puncher. Couldn't put Mike Tyson on the deck and hit him with plenty of big shots. The smash, his favorite shot that laid waste to so many heavyweights, couldn't crack Mike Tyson's chin. So Tyson had a great, great chin. And for me, Foreman would just be too slow, too easy to hit. And Mike Tyson had blitz him, I think. I don't think that fight would go more than 5 or 6 rounds. That's my personal opinion. Obviously, we'll never know because we don't have a time machine. But if you had to ask me, I reckon Mike Tyson blitzes Foreman. Shout out to Ben for the super chat. He says, what are your views on Holyfield's obvious steroid usage? Do you think this should diminish his accomplishments? 22 pounds of lean muscle for heavyweight debut and was trained by Lee Haney. The thing about the Holyfield situation is he was never actually caught. There was the very weird and beyond coincidental situation where a neighbor on his street received a package that contained whatever it was, HGH or roids, and it was addressed to a Mr. Evan Fields. Right? There was that very contentious incident, and that was quite late on in Holyfield's career, towards the back end of his career. But if you were to ask me, do I think Holyfield was on roids for most of his career? Certainly heavyweight career, I would suspect yes, he was. Strongly suspect that yes, he was. But again, technically he was never caught, so we can't out and out accuse him and say, oh, definitely. On top of all that, I saw an interview with somebody from the Nevada State Athletic Commission. And bear in mind, back in the 80s and 90s, the majority of big fights were happening in Vegas, Nevada, right? And this guy from the Nevada State Athletic Commission said, I'll never forget it, he said that they never started testing for steroids until the early 2000s. It might have been like 2002, 2003. So throughout the 90s and the 80s, there was no steroid testing in Nevada. Folks, that's crazy. And so what that means then is that there might have been countless fighters who were on roids in the 90s that we don't even know about. Now, some of them we do, like Tommy Morrison, because he admitted after his first career was over, he admitted that he was on roids the whole time. And again, since the testing back then was so lax compared to today, and it's not that people can't get away with it today, I'm sure there are many cash cow fighters who do, but back then, as I say, in places like Nevada, they weren't even testing for roids. So imagine what a free-for-all it must have been in the 90s with fighters taking roids. Roy Jones Jr. got popped for roids, as did his opponent that night. What was his name now? Richard Hall. Yeah, Richard Hall also got popped for the same substance that Roy Jones was on. Now, Jones says that he was taking a supplement called Ripped Fuel. That was the name of the supplement, Ripped Fuel. But that Ripped Fuel apparently contained all sorts of crazy substances. Back then there were muscle bodybuilding shops you could go into and buy supplements that had crazy stuff that is totally illegal in it. And apparently Roy Jones was taking that stuff, as was his opponent. I think his name was Richard Hall. His surname was certainly Hall. He was also popped for it on the same night. So basically the point I'm making is, if we take away from Holyfield's accomplishments, we have to look very closely at the other fighters as well. and take away so many of their accomplishments, because Holyfield was never caught, and there were many other fighters who potentially were on roids that were never caught as well, you know? So it's a sticky one. But yeah, shout out to Ben for the super chat. Shout out to Kayvon for the super chat as well. He says, pretty sure most 90s fighters were juiced. I don't necessarily want to say most, but I have to imagine it was pretty damn rampant in places like Nevada, since they weren't even testing for roids. You know what I mean? It would have been pretty damn rampant. Shout out to Billy the Kid. He says, hey, from a Brummie living and working in mid-Wales, your channel is great, brother. I'm a bit of a rapper myself. Your stuff is fire. Big up Billy the Kid. For those of you who are maybe confused about what he's alluding to there, check out some of my old mixtape tracks on this Rumble channel. It's called The Bottomless Drink. That's the name of the channel. And you will be impressed by at least a couple of the tracks on there. All right, spitting fire bars from back in the days. So yeah, make sure you check out. As far as tracks that have got the best feedback, a lot of people really like Wounded in Action. That one's got very good feedback. And also Moses. Those two tracks have probably got the best feedback. But there's also people that like Brixton 98, The New World as well. There's people who like all the tracks, but the ones that get the most amount of upvotes, if you will, figuratively speaking, if not literally, are Wounded in Action and Moses. So check them out on the Bottomless Drink Rumble channel. The link is in the description below. All right, back to boxing. Island Grill says, can you believe Danny Williams is still fighting? Yes, I can believe it, unfortunately. Hasball says, I think I saw a clip of Foreman, and he said the hardest he got hit was by Lyle. Yeah, I think I've heard Foreman say that. Mark Hatch says Ron Lyle had an interesting career, was in prison, turned pro only at 30. Yeah. During Ron Lyle's day, though, Ron Lyle, coming up in the 1970s, 60s, 70s, they still had boxing programs in many of the state penitentiaries back then. Bernard Hopkins, for example, learned to box in prison. He was like prison champion or something. As far as I understand it, not as many prisons nowadays, I could be totally wrong here, right? But this is what I've heard. Not as many prisons now, or not as high a percentage of prisons in America have these boxing programs in them. Whereas back then, you would literally get boxing talent coming straight out of prison. Yeah. Like Ron Lyle, like Bernard Hopkins. Joshua Hooker says, is Billy the Kid? No, hell no. Go and have a look at the music for yourself. It's fire. When I posted links to those tracks on my YouTube community page, go look at the comments. I'm not creating a bunch of sock accounts and putting them comments up. Go look at the comments for yourself. Joshua says, who do you think would have won between AJ and Hay? It's a good one, It's a good one because all the physical advantages are with AJ, but Hay had a stronger mentality. So, I don't know. If we're talking about the AJ that fought Klitschko, I might edge slightly towards AJ, but not by much. All right, so based, your mom and dad are brother and sister. You're an idiot. Go suck your mama. You got no life. But you don't need me to tell you that. Get you out of here, you joker. Idiot. Go eat a glass sandwich. Do the world a favor. Telstar says, Jerry Quarry, one of the worst cases of punch drunk I've seen, but what a warrior. Yeah, and of course, Jerry Quarry knocked out Ernie Shavers. Any of you guys see that fight? He done Ernie Shavers in the round, Jerry Quarry. But yeah, he did have terrible punch drunk syndrome. Bruno says, would George Foreman have beaten all the current heavyweights now? I don't think so. I don't see it. I don't see him beating Alexander Usyk at all. Telstar says, yeah, I've seen it. He's talking about the Shavers Quarry fight. Shavers' knees dipped within seconds. They did indeed. Quarry done him in. Matt says, how far back would you have to go for the boxers to not be remotely competitive with today's fighters? If you're talking about heavyweight, I would say back to the Floyd Patterson days. Yeah. I don't see Floyd Patterson or Ingemar Johansson being remotely competitive with today's heavyweights. Floyd Patterson in the amateurs was a middleweight. Literally a middleweight. Not like Usyk when he was just young. He was no. Floyd Patterson was a middleweight in the amateurs, turned pro at light heavyweight. Then they built him up. Costamato, his manager and trainer, built him up to heavyweight. And even then, he was only in the 180s. Floyd Patterson. Go look at his box rec. He was fighting at heavyweight in the 180s. So today, he'd be a light heavyweight still. And Floyd Patterson, of course, had a weak chin. So I don't see Patterson being remotely competitive with today's heavyweights. Neither Ingemar Johansson. Too small. Seth says Ali would have wiped the floor with all the heavyweights today. I disagree. I think Ali's got a better resume than all the heavyweights today, but I don't think he would have wiped the floor with all the heavyweights today at all. I mean, Muhammad Ali was dropped by Henry Cooper. Muhammad Ali had issues with, he won the fight, but he found Carl Mittlenberger awkward, the German southpaw. If he's finding Carl Mittlenberger awkward, how do you think he'd get along with Usyk? In a fantasy matchup, again, it's just my opinion, I might even side with Usyk over Ali, to be honest with you. Again, Ali's got the better resume. There's no question about that. But in a fantasy matchup scenario, I might even go with Usyk, judging by Ali's performance against Mittlenberger. Seth says, but Ali was out of his prime in most of these fights. No, he wasn't. He was in his prime when he fought Mittlenberger. That was in the 60s. That wasn't in the 1970s. He was in his prime when he fought Henry Cooper the first time, too. That was right before the Sonny Liston fight. We're talking about prime Ali, 60s Ali, when he fought Mittlenberger. Seth says, plus Ali is much faster than Usyk. Yeah, I'll give him more speed, but Usyk had all the technique, and Usyk's a southpaw. And again, go watch the Mittlenberger fight. Mittlenberger nowhere near as good as Usyk. Not as big, not as strong, not as technically good, not as fast. Didn't hit as hard. And Ali found it very awkward in that fight. So for me, like in a fantasy matchup, I'd probably take Usyk to win. Shout out to Striker for the super chat. He says, where would you rate Holyfield as an all-timer? Personally, I think he has become underrated, with most of that being because he fought too long and took too many losses when he was used up. Well, here's the thing about Holyfield. I did a video about him a while back, might have been a year ago, and it was called Evander Holyfield, the Occasional Great. Holyfield, throughout his career, was inconsistent. Now, was that because there were issues with the roids he was taking or whatever, PEDs? I don't know. All I can tell you is, and this was a thing in the boxing media at the time, they would point this out. He would very rarely string two impressive performances together back to back. That's why he caused so many upsets, right? Because he was inconsistent. So he comes out in the fight against Buster Douglas, where he wins the Undisputed Heavyweight Championship, destroys him in 3 rounds. In his next fight, he takes on George Foreman, who's in his 40s, and he was expected to stop Foreman. He was expected to do a number on him. But instead, the fight goes the distance, and he does batter Foreman for the most part, but Foreman has his moments. And that was seen as not a great performance by Holyfield at the time. He then fights Burt Cooper, a very late substitute. Originally, it was supposed to be Mike Tyson on that date. Tyson obviously had legal issues. The fight, he couldn't go through with the fight. Then it was supposed to be Francesco Damiani. He pulled out with an injury. In steps Burt Cooper, a journeyman, last minute notice. And he gives Evander Holyfield absolute hell. I mean, hell in the fight. Holyfield receives the first count of his career against Burt Cooper. So think about it. Great performance against Douglas. Not so great against Foreman. Bad in most people's eyes against late substitute journeyman Burt Cooper. Then he fights Larry Holmes, a guy who Mike Tyson years earlier had knocked out in 4 rounds. Holyfield struggles in that fight. To be fair to him, though, Holmes was a lot more active. Way more active going into the Holyfield fight than he was going into the Tyson fight. That has to be said. But nevertheless, Holmes was still an old man. And he gave Holyfield plenty of trouble. So Holyfield at this stage was having back-to-back-to-back unimpressive performances, unconvincing performances. Then he goes in there and gets beaten up by Riddick Bowe. So, again, this is the trajectory of Holyfield's first championship run. People didn't think of it as very impressive. But where Holyfield became great was when he came back in the rematch. He first had kind of a tune-up against Alex Stewart, which was a rematch as well. Then he goes into the second fight with Bowe, and he upsets the odds. He was thought to be finished. He was thought to be over the hill. He was thought to be done. And he didn't have a great heavyweight resume at that point. Think about it. He beat Buster Douglas, who was no great shakes really. He was a one-hit wonder. An ancient George Foreman. A journeyman in Burt Cooper. An ancient Larry Holmes. That was his heavyweight resume. Championship resume, should I say, because before he won the title, there were other heavyweight fights. So the first real significant win, the first impressive win over a young, consistent fighter that Holyfield had at heavyweight was the rematch with Riddick Bowe. That was an upset, right? But then right after that impressive win against Riddick Bowe, he gets beaten by Michael Moorer. You see the inconsistency? And then he comes back and, he fights the likes of Ray Mercer and a couple other people. Then, of course, he has the trilogy match with Riddick Bowe and gets stopped. Then he comes back after getting stopped with Riddick Bowe. He fights Bobby Ches. That wasn't a great performance. Then he goes in there against Mike Tyson as a massive underdog, understandably, and pulls off a huge upset. So that's the weird thing about Holyfield's career, and that's what makes it so difficult to judge his greatness compared to other heavyweights, is that he didn't have the consistency that some of the other greats had. But he did have some great wins, you know? As I say, Mike Tyson twice and Riddick Bowe once. They're great wins. Even Ray Mercer was a great win. The manner in which he did it, being the first guy to ever drop Mercer. So, yeah, Holyfield, the occasional great. That's why I call him, because that's what he was during his heavyweight run. He was occasionally great and probably for the most part, quite mediocre. If you think about the performances he put in, they were like, For a world champion or a world level fighter, you would say they were mediocre performances for the most part, but occasionally he'd come out with a great performance. So in that sense, you could almost compare him to Tyson Fury. Not that Tyson Fury has ever had the quality of wins historically that Holyfield did. I mean, Klitschko was a good win, but that was an old Klitschko, you know? And Wilder, you know, Wilder's no Mike Tyson. So, yeah, but in that sense, in the inconsistency, you could kind of compare Holyfield to Tyson Fury, although obviously Holyfield had a much longer run in championship fights than Tyson Fury did. Or that Tyson Fury has had so far, should I say. But shout out to Striker for the super chat. That's why it's kind of difficult to know where to place Holyfield because of that inconsistency, you know? KS says, Hatman, do you think heavyweights will keep getting bigger as time goes on? That's a good question, you know. I suspect over the next few years, we'll start to see heavyweights getting a little smaller. I could be wrong. The reason I say that is because people are a lot more conscious about the foods they're eating. And, you know, they pump these animals full of hormones. And I suspect that has an effect on how big humans grow because a lot of the meat they're eating is full of growth hormone. I suspect that that's a factor. I don't know for certain. I haven't done any science on it. It's just a suspicion of mine. And also because of the way the economies are going in most countries, people are having to tighten their purse strings and they're going to be eating less. And that also will contribute, I think, to people getting smaller in the coming decades. So to answer your question, I could be totally wrong, but I suspect that we won't see the fighters continue to get bigger over the next 10, 20, 30 years at heavyweight. I suspect not. I reckon Fury might be as big as the fighters will get before they start to come down a bit. In fact, with the next generation, with the exception of Bakadir Jalilov, we're already seeing that. Moses Talma is 6'2". Jared Anderson 6'4". Richard Torres is about 6'2" as well, 6'2", 6'3". Dubois is 6'5". So, yeah, with the exception of Jalilov, who's 6'7", I reckon the heavyweights are going to get a little smaller over the next few decades. Is my chat frozen again here? Let me see. You know, it always freezes at some point during the stream. It wouldn't be normal without it doing that, right? Let's open this up again. See if I can revive it. Okay, yeah, my stream was frozen. and missed a couple of super chats, so I'll get onto those. Kayvon Green with a super chat says, with modern training, nutrition, and size, I can't see anyone from before the 90s being competitive today, especially in a 12-round fight. I think that the fighters from the 70s, or some of them, would be competitive today. I think that George Foreman would be competitive. I think that Ali would be competitive. Even, the 60s Ali would be competitive. I even think somebody like Jimmy Young will be competitive today. I'm not saying these guys would necessarily dominate boxing, but I reckon they'd be competitive. So that's just my 2 cents. We're all giving our opinions. None of us know for sure. We don't have a time machine. So shout out to Kayvon Green. Big up Black Dynamite. He says, who have you got in a fight between Jake Paul and Babbage? You know what? After Babbage's last couple performances, I might even edge towards Jake Paul because Babbage has no chin at all at this stage. None. Absolutely none. So at this stage, the Babbage of a few years ago, I'd pick to beat Jake Paul. But the Babbage now, I reckon Jake Paul might be able to take it. Seth says, Hatman, I got James Toney beating Usyk at cruiser. Agree or disagree? I disagree. I think Usyk beats James Toney at cruiser all day long. Says James Toney's skill set is legendary. Yeah, James Toney also lost plenty of fights. James Toney, when he won the cruiserweight title against Jirov, was actually in the wilderness up to that point. He was in the wilderness because he lost to the likes of Montel Griffin. And there was another guy. Did he lose to him or have a draw? I forget the guy's name now. Let me look up the guy's name. So I remember that fight. And all the boxing media at the time was saying, what has happened to James Toney? At one stage, we thought this guy was like top 5 pound for pound in boxing. But since his loss to Roy Jones, his career's gone down the toilet. He ended up losing to Montel Griffin and, hang on, let me have a look here. There was another guy. He either had a draw with him or lost to him. I forget the guy's name. Was it Drake something? Let me have a look here. Yeah, so he lost to Montel Griffin. That was right after the Roy Jones fight, where he got comfortably schooled by Roy Jones. Oh, he lost to Montel Griffin a second time. And yes, that's the guy, Drake Tadzi. Is it Tadzi or Thadzi? I'm not sure how to pronounce it. A Malawian fighter beat James Toney. Did you know that? The guy who was talking about James Toney's amazing skills. James Toney, 175 pounds, lost to Drake Tadzi. I'm going to call him Tadzi because Southern Africans that I've known, they don't pronounce it as a TH the way that we would in English. They just pronounce it as the T and a silent H. So Drake Tadzi, yeah, he beat James Toney. James Toney was in the wilderness, right, when he had that win over Vasily Jirov. That was his comeback. That was like James Toney returning to the big time. Because, he moved up to the cruiserweight division after he lost to Drake Tadzi. And then he had a bunch of fights against pretty obscure opposition. And then eventually it culminated in challenging Jirov, who was the favorite going in. And of course, Jirov a southpaw. So, Toney had some rough times in his career, very rough times. So now I've got Usyk beating James Toney at cruiser all day long. All day long. I think Usyk, too good a boxer for him. Yeah, James Toney had some success against people like Hasim Rahman. at heavyweight. John Ruiz. Who else was there now? Evander Holyfield, obviously, but way, way, way past his best version of Evander Holyfield. Holyfield totally washed up at that stage. James Toney was not at his best himself, of course, but he lost to Denis Lebedev. Some of you guys may remember that fight. So, yeah, and the Hasim Ratman fight was, well, the first Hasim Ratman fight was a draw. The second one was a no contest. Yeah, Samuel Peter. Did I mention Samuel Peter? Yeah, he lost to Samuel Peter at heavyweight, James Toney. And the loss to Samuel Peter was 3 years after his win at cruiserweight over Jirov. So, make it out what you will. You reckon a guy who is losing to Samuel Peter is going to beat Usyk? I know styles make fights, but I just don't see it. All right, one sec, peeps. I'll be back in a moment. One sec, hold tight. Let me put the graphic up. Let me put the graphic up here. I do have a Be Right Back graphic, so hold tight for a couple minutes. I'll be back. All right, I'm back. Make sure there's no other super chats. Make sure I've got them all. Yeah, got them all. And incidentally, on these streams, there's been a few times when people have told me about dodgy audio where it starts to break up or it gets crackly. And people have found that if they just simply refresh the page that they're watching on, refresh the tab, that usually takes care of the issues. So it appears to be, I don't know, a YouTube issue rather than an equipment or connection issue on my end. Otherwise, why would it be solved by viewers refreshing their tab? So yeah, if that happens, then try that as a solution. Speaking of tabs, I probably have to refresh my chat tab here. Always happens a couple times. And we got 261 concurrent viewers. If you guys can all stick a like on this stream, it would really help. We've got 95 likes at the moment. If we can get up to, let's say, 135, so 40 likes, be much appreciated. All right, there's a debate that's broken out in the chat. People talking about Sebastian Fundora and Nick Bull. How are those two guys getting compared? One of the smallest fighters, at least shortest fighters in boxing, against one of the tallest, at least for his weight class. Somebody saying Deontay Wilder sparred Lomachenko. What? Okay, Austin Spears says, well, he's asking the chat, but he says, if a prime Jerry Quarry fought in the 80s, how do you think he would do against Pinkland Thomas, Tucker Tubbs, James Smith, Witherspoon, and Dokes? Well, you know, Jerry Quarry was very tough, and he was a game, gritty fighter. He had decent power, but he was very small, of course. Jerry Quarry in his prime might have been 200 pounds. So very small, probably just about 6 feet in height. And very hittable, obviously. That's how he ended up punch drunk. I wouldn't pick him over most of those guys, if any of them, to be honest with you. If you're talking about all those guys in their primes, the one who I would have given him the best shot against would be Bone Crusher Smith. Because Bone Crusher Smith was very limited. He was a big, strong, powerful guy, but limited. The others, like Pinkland Thomas, even though he had a heroin addiction problem, in his prime, he had a very good jab. He was pretty fast. He had a great chin himself, Pinkland Thomas, in his prime years. So I'd probably pick Pinkland Thomas over the Irishman. I'd pick Tucker over him, Tubbs, and definitely Witherspoon, and Dokes too. Dokes is another one who had substance abuse problems. But At his best, he had tremendous hand speed, great combination puncher. I'd pick him over Quarry as well. Quarry was... Maybe you could describe Quarry as like a fringe contender. Was he like the Derek Chisora of his day? Maybe. Something like that. Jackie Boy Johnson says, is Chisora a good name to have on your resume? Historically, no, it doesn't really mean much. Linkage says 90s Foreman versus Frank Bruno. That's a very, very interesting fight. I'll probably go with 90s Foreman. Yeah, I'll probably go with 90s Foreman. Actually, no. I'll go with... Yeah, okay, yeah. I'll go with 90s Foreman over Bruno. Yeah. Very early 90s. Not the Foreman who beat... more like late 80s Foreman. Late 80s, early 90s Foreman. I'd pick over Bruno. But not the Foreman that fought Michael Moorer. Not that version. The place says Prime Foreman versus Prime Lennox. I got Prime Lennox. Striker says 90s Foreman would eventually catch Bruno. Yeah, that's my thinking. So the Foreman who fought, let's say, Holyfield against Bruno. Bruno had notoriously bad stamina. Bruno could box. Don't get it twisted. He was an underrated boxer. So I reckon in the early rounds, he'd be sticking Foreman with the jab, landing some nice shots and making it difficult for George Foreman. But I reckon Foreman's persistence would eventually get to Bruno and he'd probably stop him. Jimbo Jones says Ernie Shavers versus Derek Chisora. It's a good fight. I might go Chisora over Shavers. Yeah, why not? If Jerry Quarry knocked out Ernie Shavers, you telling me Derek Chisora can't? And several other people beat Ernie Shavers, by the way. Didn't have the greatest chin. He was a very good puncher, but very vulnerable. Seth is talking about the pyramids being in great shape. Yeah, the pyramids are in fantastic shape for the age. I mean, you look at structures which were built long after the pyramids. In ancient Greece, for example, most of them are completely disintegrated at this point. Or many of them anyway. They're completely disintegrated. There's just little bits of rubble left. But the Great Pyramid, at least, and many of the monuments in Egypt have... because of the way they've been constructed and the size of them with stone and whatnot. I mean, stone buildings of that size with blocks that big, they're built to last. Our modern constructions are bigger, of course, and more complex with electricity and glass and steel and so on and so forth, but they won't last as long as the pyramids for sure. They definitely won't. The box says Joe Frazier versus AJ. I got AJ. I think Joe Frazier too small. Again, Joe Frazier, about 5'11", in his prime, slightly over 200 pounds, about 206, 207 pounds. We're talking about somebody who's under 15 stone. And Frazier didn't have a great chin. I wouldn't say Frazier was chinny, but, you know, he didn't have an amazing chin. Let's just put it that way. Matt says, why did the cross-arm guard go out of fashion? It seems logical for certain styles of pressure fighter. Now everyone either uses a traditional guard or a Philly shell. Yeah, that's a good question. I think one of the things about the cross-arm guard is that it ties up your arms more so than a traditional earmuff guard. So you can't punch from the cross-arm guard as easily, out of the cross-arm guard as easily as you can from a traditional guard or out of a Philly shell. I think that's what most fighters who try it will find. So it's kind of a passive defense, really, isn't it, when you got the cross-arm guard? I know some fighters like Archie Moore, Ken Norton, George Foreman, they still made it work, and they were able to switch between defense and offense and whatnot. But I suspect most people who try it will just find it awkward to quickly punch out of that position with their arms are crossed. Dominic says, Chisora likes cross guard. Yeah, but not really like the Archie Moore, George Foreman, Ken Norton cross-arm guard. Chisora will do it like occasionally for a split second here or there. Whereas with Foreman, for example, you would see prolonged periods, especially the old version of Foreman, prolonged periods where he's crossing his arms like that in the Holyfield fight, for example, and blocking your punches. Gorguga says they found huge cylinders underneath the Giza pyramids a few days ago using ground radar. Yeah, we spoke about this on previous streams. There was one person who said that he reckons it's a hoax by the Egyptian government in order to drum up more tourism. And being objective, I'm open to that. I'm open to it being an Egyptian government hoax because the Egyptian government have pumped out industrial levels of BS about ancient Egypt over the decades. Oh, yes, they have. But at the same time, they've also put out a lot of good stuff about ancient, a lot of true stuff. So I wouldn't put it past them. Let me just put it that way. But I also wouldn't put it past the ancient Egyptians having structures underneath the Giza plateau. So will we find out the truth in due course? I hope so. One way or the other. Billy the Kid says, do you think Hay or Klitschko could beat Fury now? What, as in the Hay of today and the Klitschko of today? Hell no. What do you mean in their primes? It's funny. On the last stream, there was somebody who said, let's get the boxing chat out of the way so we can talk about pyramids and Palpatine. We've spoken about pyramids. Let's talk about Palpatine now. Let's talk about Palpatine. Gorguga says, if they're real, then I think they might be connected to earthquake stabilization for the structure. Possibly, but the ancient Egyptians, of course, were a deeply, deeply spiritual people. And their mindset was very different to our mindset today, because most people today in the developed nations are not very spiritual, whereas the ancient Egyptians were obsessed with spirituality and so on. It's like, today, other than maybe in Islamic countries, but in Western countries, they're not going to build incredible monuments anymore for worshipping God, like St. Paul's Cathedral or some of the other cathedrals in Europe. They don't build stuff like that anymore. People don't take religion and spirituality as seriously anymore to be putting that much effort into incredible architecture in the veneration of God. Now, obviously, religions have a sociological function, utility to them. It's not just about, praising God and all that. But again, the ancient Egyptians were deeply spiritual people. They were obsessed with the afterlife, and that's what mummification was all about, and so on and so forth. I mean, in the early dynasties, I think it was only the first dynasty, or maybe I think it was the first dynasty. The first dynasty in mainstream Egyptological chronology was the first pharaoh was called Narmer, and that dynasty was the only one that I'm aware of. After that dynasty was finished, I think that dynasty lasted for like 200 years or something, 150 years. And in that dynasty, they were the ones who were burying their servants alive with the pharaoh. Yeah, when the pharaoh died, he would have his servants buried alive with him. And that's something that actually they were doing in a lot of African cultures until I think quite recently. Yeah, they'll still do. I mean, when I say quite recently, up until a few, maybe century or two ago, there were still some kings that were like being buried with their servants. Crazy. Why would you, maybe they were slaves, right? But why would you want to be a servant for a king when they've got practices like that going on? Because the idea is, I think, that the pharaoh in death would want his favorite servants with him. He wants his favorite servants with him in the afterlife. It's crazy. I mean, talk about megalomaniac, huh? Taking live servants with you. That's horrible. Jimbo says, after they sealed that tomb, those servants in there must have had some mad convos. Oh my days. Yeah, it doesn't even bear thinking about, does it? How cruel that is to do that to people. What a madness. Somebody, Triple R's asking me about the mummies in China. I haven't looked deeply into it, but I have seen a couple YouTube videos and whatnot about mummies in China. You say that they're the best preserved mummies in history. Kylie says, do you remember when the Mexican government did a press conference showing alien bodies? I don't think I saw that, to be fair. Linkage says, was there any evidence of cannibalism in ancient Egypt? Not widespread, as far as I'm aware anyway, but you're talking about a culture that lasted at least 3,500 years. So a lot of stuff can happen in that kind of time period. I mean, they could have gone through phases where there was cannibalism and then other phases where there wasn't. It's an enormously long time period. Sometimes people talk about, in fact, oftentimes, people talk about ancient Egypt like it was a 90-minute movie or something. No. It's 3,500 years at least. So an awful lot of stuff happened, you know, and changes in culture within Egypt would have happened during that time. Like massive changes. So there may have been times when there was cannibalism going on and other times when it was outlawed and, you know, God knows. Seth says, Hatman, what is your favorite animal? One of my favorite animals is the great white shark. I won't want to be near one, but you know, watching him on a screen in the comfort of my home, I enjoy them. But I wouldn't want to be in the water with one. But yeah, I do like great white sharks. Ayed says, but being hunted by one, hell no, exactly. I am not going in the water, in any waters where there's great white sharks. You won't find me in there. And Seth says, be near an orca and no shark will dare come near you. Yeah, but truth be told, you don't want to be in the water with orcas either. Generally, they don't attack humans, but there have been cases when they do. Yeah, orcas hunt great whites, that's right. The orca is the apex predator. The orca is the largest. Well, I mean, technically you could say that even a blue whale is a predator because they eat like krill, right? Or plankton and krill and stuff like that, which are microorganisms. So technically, they're still preying on those things. Seth says only one confirmed kill, and that was deemed accidental. No, there's a lot more than one confirmed kill. Orcas have killed people in captivity. There's been cases of orcas drowning people in those, whatever you call them. You know, those arenas where they have orcas in captivity and whatnot. And there were certain orcas who drowned people in there deliberately. No accident thing. Grabbed the trainers or whatever and dragged them down to the bottom of the pool and killed them. Island Grill says the sperm whale. Okay, yeah, the sperm whale eats like giant squid and stuff like that. So yeah. Black Dynamite says I'm more curious about colossal squids. Krakens. Colossal squid, the Kraken. Ayed says the Spain version of SeaWorld had multiple incidents with orcas too. Gorguga says I still haven't seen the Meg 2. Do you really want to? To my shame, I've seen both films. You can tell I was bored, right? Watching Meg and Meg 2. Jackie Boy Johnson says it's rubbish. It is. Both Meg films are rubbish, really. But somehow I watched them. So go figure. Okay, Hasbol is talking about the possibility of reincarnation. I'm open to it. I'm agnostic. But as I said on a previous stream, I hope that reincarnation isn't real, because I don't want to come back here. Yeah, I've had more than enough experience in this world to say, yeah, that's enough for me. This place is crazy. The only way that coming back to this world would be appealing to me is if I could pick the circumstances and the actual person that I'd be reincarnated as. But if it's like random, like a lottery thing, hell no. Pacer says, hope not. I don't want to go through school again. Me neither. Do not want to come back to this place. Linkage says, Statham movies are a guilty pleasure. Kayvon Green says, we are living in a simulation. KS says, who would be worse to have as a father, John Fury or Chris Sr.? Definitely John Fury. Easily John Fury. Not that Chris Sr. would be the easiest father to have around, but infinitely preferable to John Fury. L says, will Trump be the last president? Yeah, I've heard him say that, and I've heard a lot of speculation about what he meant by that. Who knows? KS says Chris Sr. seems unbearable, though control freak. Yeah, he's a control freak, as is John Fury. So you've got a control freak with a velvet glove or a control freak with an iron fist. Pick your poison. Pacer says, just sub to Chris Eubank's YouTube channel. It's a good laugh. It is indeed. I recommend everyone check the channel out. Very funny. Whether he intends it to be or not, it's very funny. L360 says, bad furniture. You don't like the decor. Seth says, I find Eubank Sr. is corny and a tryhard. Okay. Different strokes for different folks. Personally, I find him hilarious. George Evans says, is Harlem Eubank more talented than Junior? In my opinion, definitely not. I actually think Harlem Eubank is like an inferior version of Eubank Jr., truth be told. Jimbo Jones says, how did Eubank even start with the posh gimmick? And how has he kept it going for so long? Well, his dad, who was Jamaican, born and raised in Jamaica, came from a generation of Caribbeans who were enamored with the royal family. So a lot of Jamaicans of that generation in Jamaica itself would have pictures of the Queen up on their living room wall, right? And some of them would try to talk in an aristocratic English accent because being a British colony, Jamaicans were always taught that Britain is the motherland. That's where you get civility from and culture and so on and so forth. And the Queen is like held aloft, right? So there was definitely quite a lot of Jamaicans of a certain generation who were like that, and they would literally try to be British. And so Eubank Sr.'s dad was one of them. He was given the nickname by his friends, English. And so Eubank, Chris Eubank, who we call Senior today, he basically took it from his dad. And then he took it to the next level. Because his dad was a relatively, working class Jamaican guy, never made any money. So he couldn't, live that role of being like a sophisticated English gentleman, an aristocrat, right? Whereas Chris Eubank could. He had the money to, buy the mansion and wear the jodhpurs and the monocle and the cane and, live the dream. Exactly, Dr. Wu. Hence the names. Winston, James, Livingston. Exactly. These are popular names within the older generations in the Caribbean. Matt says, I vaguely remember an old Eubank Sr. post-fight interview where he was speaking with a normal urban accent. Well, I've spoken to Eubank Sr. and he weren't talking posh to me, I'll tell you that. I spoke to him on the phone and he was talking like a normal guy from London. He weren't talking like no posh man or anything like that. When I spoke to him on the phone, he was talking normal, mate. And in fact, one of my good friends' dads grew up with Eubank. He grew up with Eubank and Nigel Benn. Elliot says, how did the phone call happen? He reached out to me and invited me to come down to Brighton to interview him and his son. Seth says, Hatman, would you do a sit-down interview with Dr. Umar? No. No, I would not. Yeah, and as Jimbo Jones said there, in his post-fight interviews, when he was fighting Eubank Sr., they were mostly normal. He wasn't putting on the weird aristocratic accent and all that. It's something he kind of developed. Over time, his put-on accent has become increasingly posh and aristocratic. You go look when he fought Nigel Benn in a post-fight interview. He weren't coming with no aristocratic accent after the fight. He was talking normal. It's something it's a character that he developed more and more and more as time went on. Shout out to Lawrence King for the super chat. He says, if you want to hear Eubank's real voice, listen to his post-fight interview after Benn. Yeah, that's what he was normally like for a lot of his career. He was talking normal. The posh aristocrat Eubank was a character that would come out like in television interviews when he was in a studio and stuff like that. He'd turn up with the monocle and the jodhpurs and all that. But at fight press conferences and even after the fights and the post-fight interviews, he was talking normally most of the time. And just occasionally he'd come out with the character, right? But now the character's become like a permanent thing when he's in the public eye. He's constantly in character in public. Dominic K says, developed to the point where he became the character. Yeah, like some actors who literally become the character they're going to play in a movie for several months. And that's why, for example, Daniel Day-Lewis actually retired for a while during his career. He had to be persuaded by Martin Scorsese to come out of retirement and play Bill the Butcher in Gangs of New York. Like Scorsese had to work on him for quite a while to get him to come out of retirement, because he said that the process of getting into characters, becoming the characters and whatnot over several months in the run-up to making a movie basically took its toll on him as far as his mental health, as you could imagine, because these guys are literally becoming the people that they're going to play. You know what I mean? So it can screw you up a bit psychologically when you're going that deep into becoming somebody else. Seth says, Hatman, have you watched the Why Are You Gay interview? Yeah, you're talking about Pastor Semper. Hilarious. That's a classic. Saw that many years ago, and I still from time to time watch it today because it's so funny. Martin Semper from Uganda. Shout out to Lawrence for the super chat. He says, flying back home to London to watch Eubank Ben. I'll leave the nice watches at home. So where are you flying from, if I might ask? Sound like Eubank Senior now. KS says, Hatman, do you think Dubois will become more talkative and charismatic as he gets older? Or is it just the way he is? Well, yeah, he is coming out of his shell already. You know, he's more talkative now than he was 3-4 years ago. But he's never going to be charismatic per se. But it's all relative, right? So he'll be more charismatic than he is now, yeah. But he's not going to be somebody that most people would regard as charismatic, you know? Okay, Lawrence says he is in Paraguay. He says, believe it or not, it's safer here than back home. Shout out to Lawrence King. He knows about Latin America. Black Dynamite says the Ugandan presenter who is alongside Pastor Semper lives in Dubai now. He's getting even more popular. Yeah, he's called Simon. I really struggle to pronounce his surname. It's like Kigwangela or something like that. Yeah, he's hilarious as well. I've seen his Instagram page. Okay, user guest says, yep, Heath Ledger the Joker. This role killed him. And I mentioned in a previous stream that Jack Nicholson, after Heath Ledger's death, came out and said that he warned Heath Ledger about taking that role. So make of that what you will. But he said he warned Heath Ledger that taking that role would basically destroy his mental health and destroy his sanity. Jazz says, why did it destroy his mental health? I don't know, and I don't know whether it actually did. I'm just relaying what Jack Nicholson said. Because obviously Jack Nicholson had played the Joker in the Tim Burton Batman. And he said he spoke to Heath Ledger when Ledger was thinking about taking the Joker role for the new Batman, right? And he was saying this after Heath Ledger had already died. He said, yeah, I warned him not to take that role. I warned him, like, be very careful because it will mess you up. All right, peeps, I'm going to draw the curtain on this one. As always, thank you to each and every one of you for joining the conversation. It's been very enjoyable. Hopefully you guys Enjoyed it too. In fact, last super chat from Lawrence King, he says, a lot of weird stuff happens too in Hollywood with strange, untimely deaths. Hey, that's a whole live stream by itself. The weird Hollywood deaths. I mean, that's why they call it Hollyweird, right? Rather than Hollywood, Hollyweird. So, yeah, shout out to Lawrence King for the super chat there. Yeah, so going to wrap this one up. Appreciate you guys as always. Hopefully you've enjoyed the stream. Special shout out to everyone who donated via super chat. Take care, be good, and I'll catch you guys on the next one. I'm out.